Some games don't need to convince you that they're fun. Sometimes it's self-evident from the beginning that a particular experience is meant to be enjoyed by many people. Katamari Damacy, a name that roughly translates to Clump Soul in English, was released in 2004 by Namco on PlayStation 2, and its creation is largely credited to auteur game designer Keita Takahashi. I don't think it's imperative that you play this game before watching this video, as the feeling of rolling up your first person, car, and building will still be a blast no matter what. I'll talk about the story, but it's such a small part of the game that I don't foresee it affecting your enjoyment at all. But if you're someone who's sensitive to spoilers, be forewarned that this video will contain them. This is not a review, rather a discussion, but if you'd like a recommendation for Katamari, then here's mine. Go play it. It's very fun and won't take you longer than a few hours to complete. It's an unforgettable game. There's a reason it still has a fan base even after 14 years. My personal reason for making this video now, after all this time, is twofold. First, to direct some attention to less appreciated facets of the game. You don't need to be told how good this game looks. The game can convey that on its own. But I hope to discuss some wise design choices that are a little less obvious, that serve the vision of Katamari Damacy as a unified work. Second, as the beginning of an ongoing series of discussions I will have on 5 of Mr. Takahashi's games, including Katamari Damacy's sequel, We Love Katamari, Nobi Nobi Boy, Alphabet, and the forthcoming Watam. As this game is so unique and personal, I feel inclined to provide some basic information on Mr. Takahashi. When he joined Namco, he had no experience making games, but was a recent graduate from art school and had an interest in creating games which stemmed back from his childhood. Including 10 video game design students, the team that produced Katamari was only 17 people, with a very modest budget relative to other games of the day, and they created the game in about half a year. From interviews I've read pertaining to the development of the game, Namco wanted something different and felt that many games created in the early 2000s had stagnated creatively. They believed that Keita Takahashi could offer the world something different. Although single individuals are credited as auteurs like Hidetaka Miyazaki, Hideo Kojima, and Warren Spector, who seem to stand out and act as the figurehead for a game, each end product the player experiences was made not only by one person, but a whole team. I'm saying this not because I mean to diminish the impact of Deus Ex, the Soulsborne series, or the Metal Gear Solid series. In fact, I'm a very big fan of each of the examples of developers and games I used, but the point must be acknowledged nonetheless. From a certain perspective, it becomes easier to sell a game to a market where one person can be used to represent the tenets of their game, even if they had very little to do with its development. It's worth noting that this game isn't marketed as Keita Takahashi's Katamari Damacy, nor were any of his subsequent releases. I bring this up to illuminate that neither Namco or Keita Takahashi himself solicited this kind of spotlight with their marketing. I'm praising Mr. Takahashi's work only after careful examination of his games. Information I've gathered from interviews that I've read with Mr. Takahashi and the games that he made with teams after leaving Namco Bandai led me to believe that he's a very strong creative presence in the games he's connected with, and it's very notable when his presence is lacking in games in which his style is emulated. For fans of the series, I would point to Katamari Forever as an example of this. Keita Takahashi's care and creativity is the underlying reason I wish to create a series of videos examining his work in greater detail. One of the recipients of this care and creativity is the story. The impetus behind rolling Katamaris in the first place would be the accidental destruction of the moon and stars by the King of the Cosmos, the father of the player-controlled prince. As a counter to the silent protagonist, the King of the Cosmos is anything but mute. He immediately places the onus of repairing the night sky onto the prince, and often lightly chastises him before, during, and after levels. During the course of the game, we see vignettes of a mother, son, and daughter who are traveling to see the father of the family launch into space on a rocket ship. Although the story isn't really presented as the main focal point of the game, there are aspects of the story that illuminate important themes of it. During the cutscenes, the son informs the mother that the stars have disappeared from the night sky, and she quickly dismisses his claim. The daughter plays a more oblique role in these cutscenes as she never says anything, even when directly addressed. only speaking after missions where we rebuild constellations, exclaiming that she can feel the rebuilding of the cosmos.
Oh, I feel it. I feel the cosmos. Corona Borealis is back on top.
The son has earthly information, the daughter has a special connection to the cosmos, and the prince becomes the new creator of all the stars. These three children are put in special roles, all of whom are somehow guided by their inherent purity, as they lack the jaded cynicism of the king of the cosmos and the mother. Either of these prominent adults seem to exude some sense of routine banality. It's the king's job to look after the cosmos, so it isn't exciting for him to create stars anymore. He's only vicariously excited through the prince when he rolls up something interesting, or exceeds his expectations at the end of a level. Likewise, the mother clearly values her family, but isn't interested in what her son has to say, as his words come across as projections of a child's active imagination. That childlike sense of wonder the story stresses expands out to be one of the key characteristics of this game, which is congruent with his sense of presentation, but also with how the player is meant to enjoy it. It sounds obvious, but if you don't accept the fact that this game isn't about headshots, frame-perfect dodges, and technical know-how, then you'll likely not get the most out of this experience. In a 2018 interview with news outlet Polygon, which is linked in the description, Keita Takahashi said, "Katamari is about mass consumption." I think this is an interesting statement to make considering the core of the game revolves around collection rather than consumption, but in the context of the game they're one and the same. I think a careful examination of any media could yield some superficial undertones of something that is larger than the actual work itself, however unjustified. For example, a game of chess can be seen as a hierarchical sacrificial culling of the poor, while the royal family is safe from harm until lines are breached, and the male figurehead of the game must be saved by his infinitely more capable female counterpart. In reality, that's the game when we view it through the lens of tradition, but the names are arbitrary and have no relation to the actual game. They're only used as tools to aid the player's memory. If we called the pawns in a chess game lions and the queen sheep, it would not stop the queen from being the most versatile and threatening piece on the board. My point here is that Katamari was framed in such a way that consumption and destruction are part of the main cycle of gameplay, not an extrapolated metaphor. I think Keita Takahashi had the goal of highlighting mass consumption in mind while developing the game as evidenced by collecting items around the map, which creates a more barren and devoid world. Animals, people, and sometimes inanimate objects flee from the impending capture by the Princess Ball. We don't need a bigger Katamari to create a star, but we chase down the unwilling masses to consume because we covet it. The underpinning that connects Keita Takahashi's games is the sense of questioning what really matters in our lives. And while I don't want to discuss his games in great detail at this very moment, it's a theme that we'll be exploring in future videos. More specifically to the gameplay of Katamari, there's a staggering amount of items in the game, and the variety of each subset of items is equally as impressive. There isn't just one version of a crab or piece of sushi, there's oftentimes many. Some are palette swaps, some are multiple items combined, some are assets with different positions or poses, and some are complete remodels, but the sheer number of objects still impresses me to this day. Each area seems to be carefully populated by interesting objects in a mix of equal parts comically exaggerated realism and whimsical absurdity. Many times assets are used to visually inform the player of an intended path of progression without outright telling you the most optimal order of collection. You might get to a point where you can roll up a child, an adult, then an adult on a motorcycle, creating a satisfying few moments where your goals are self-created, yet clearly laid out, and item variety pushes you forward. Ultimately, I don't think this game's really about optimization. It's more about reveling in the absurdity. But I think the developers made a great effort to signify progression to the player through asset variation that feels engaging to a player looking for a unique experience that's unparalleled even to this day. Many of the objects feel singular when rolled up and interact with the Princess Katamari differently by way of varied hitbox proportions. At the start of a level, many large objects are impossible to consume due to their sheer size and can act as obstacles, steps to climb, or objects to mount. During transitions triggered when a player reaches a certain size milestone, the King of the Cosmos offers the player words of discouragement while the game seemingly changes these large objects into interactable objects, which gives the player a real sense of interactivity and makes the world feel tangible but not overwhelming. More or less every item can be rolled up, and it's obvious what you can roll up in regards to your current size. Without ever telling the player explicitly, if you're the size of a cat, you can't roll up a building. It's inherent in the game's design, and when you finally get to that size and start rolling up a large variety of objects, it's immensely gratifying. In most modern games, detail is directly proportionate with distance. The farther away you are from something, the less detailed it is, and during the era of PS2, more often than not, the closer you get to something, the less detailed it appeared as well. Katamari Damacy dealt with graphics and by extension performance on the PS2 in an interesting way. Items and characters are mostly flat, polygonal structures with modest details that represent their real-life counterparts to various levels of abstraction. This services the player's ability to sight-read an object from a distance, since objects are easy to parse due to their simplicity. When a level starts and the camera is fairly close to the prince in his Katamari, items are easily recognizable, even if they're too big to see in full from our current perspective. When the camera zooms out after the player advances a level, smaller details are still available since objects are so clear. Only a menial amount of information is lost in translation from different perspectives. Distance just gives the user more appreciation for the beautiful visuals by way of encouraging them to see more and keep growing their Katamari. This incentivizes the player to further the gameplay loop, since growing our Katamari is the main crux of the game. I'm also certain this choice to render the world in this way also contributed to lightning fast loading times, which is impressive considering how many unique and interactive objects are in any given level. Loading screens are at most a few seconds long, so fast that on the original hardware the King of the Cosmos rarely has time to finish his sentences. I make these points in effort of demonstrating that the game was made with optimization in mind, in service of providing the player with forward momentum. Loading times can be a divisive topic, but in a game like The Witcher 3, the load times can be considerable on consoles. But since the game loads in such a huge amount of information, and then continues to load off-screen areas while you're playing, this seems reasonable. In a game like Katamari Damacy, when your main goal as a player could be crudely stated as moving forward and accumulating objects, fast loading makes the downtime less irksome and encourages the player to continue playing its short levels uninhibited. If each object was rendered photorealistically, we would lose this feature and the whole experience would be unwieldy and cumbersome. In large part, Katamari Damacy is about collision. When you think about it removed from just this game, collision is one of the largest problems in all of gaming and has been for a long time. In a multiplayer shooter, if a character model is sticking through a wall and they're killed for something that isn't their fault, it degrades consumer confidence and lowers the competitive viability of the game because it cheats players out of its core rules due to a relatively common bug. Katamari embraces collision and turns it into a mechanic. While objects do clip into your Katamari in an obvious way, it doesn't seem unrealistic or immersion breaking due to the way that objects are sucked into the Katamari to form a more spherical and easy to roll ball. The graphics are heavily abstracted, which makes it easier to accept a person who's standing perfectly upright and makes almost no visible effort to free themselves when stuck to a Katamari, in turn making the Katamari easier to roll. At the start of the game, a tutorial message appears on screen that informs players of odd-shaped objects, which when rolled up, force the Katamari to move in less smooth ways. This feature manifests itself in some really intelligent ways where some objects do give an exaggerated tilt to the roll, but most of the time it isn't an extreme change. For example, when you roll up an object that's much longer than your Katamari's diameter, a portion of it may clip into the floor when it rolls across the bottom of the Katamari. That way you don't have a Katamari with a big bump in the middle that could vault itself over objects on the ground, making rolling up objects less efficient and less fun. This happens to a small degree so that different objects feel like they're making a difference on your Katamari when rolled up, but not to an annoying degree due to the floor clipping, which is again all in service of making the game fun. When the original PlayStation controller was conceived, each face button was designed to serve a specific purpose, and if developers followed general Sony guidelines, PlayStation owners could expect similar control schemes for multiple games, which creates a unified brand that the user intellectually invests into. This was of course before the homogenization of control schemes. Think about the difference between the maximalist Atari 5200 controller, released in 1982, and the minimalist Famicom controller released in 1983, which were worlds apart. Looking at any of Keita Takahashi's games, natural and intuitive controls are a key concept, and during the 2004 release of Katamari Damacy, the sixth console generation was in full swing, only a year before the release of the Xbox 360 and 2 years before the release of PlayStation 3. During this period of time, video games had relatively similar control schemes, and with Katamari, Mr. Takahashi and his team chose to differ from control norms of the day. The benefit of this unorthodox control scheme is that you never have to remove your thumbs from the control sticks to move. A number of different moves are available to you by permutations of control stick manipulation, and optional commands are on the L1 and R1 buttons that are normally controlled by the index fingers. Imagine if you had to brake by pressing the X button, or if you had to quick turn by pressing down one of the directional buttons. That kind of choice could have broken this game. This choice of controls not only makes sense by never requiring your thumbs to move, but also makes sense because each of the control sticks ostensibly represent one of the prince's arms. I consider it a problem well solved. All that being said, it's somewhat sad to see that Bandai Namco has commodified the series. The overall level of quality has dropped in my opinion. While I wish no ill will towards the possible next installations of the series, it's well worth mentioning that the first two games, the only two that Keita Takahashi worked on, are largely considered to be the strongest in the series by fans. I think there's a lot of care put into the development of Katamari, and I consider the game a classic in my library. Although I think this game has less analytical discourse on it than it deserves, mostly due to its whimsical design, its wholly singular nature gives the player an experience they can't find elsewhere. Even after spending so much time discussing some of the more esoteric aspects of the game, at the core, my thoughts about Katamari is how easy and fun the game is to play. It feels good to roll things up and to be enveloped by the world. I won't forget the feeling of seeing this game come out as a teenager and being intrigued by the sheer oddity of it. When I finally got to play this game, it didn't disappoint, and it was fun and hypnotic, and I loved every second of it. I'm glad I can come back to it as an adult and still get something very unique out of the game and enjoy it on a whole new level. With that, I'd like to thank the development team for working on the game, and you, the viewer, for taking your time to watch this video. I appreciate that. If you'd like some reading on Keita Takahashi and his work, I've included some interviews in the description that I used to make this video, although there are many, many more available. If you'd like to stay updated on what this channel is up to, you know how to do that. Thanks again.